Well, there are still many unanswered questions related to Michael Flynn. Why did he admit to lying to the vice president in his resignation letter? Our guest can share some insight because why? He was there. He was brought into the administration by General Flynn himself to be the Deputy National Security Advisor and spokesman. We are glad to welcome Mr. Michael Anton. Mr. Anton, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So one of the big things the Democrats are saying right now is that General Flynn pled guilty and he signed a resignation letter to the president admitting that he had misled the vice president. You were there. Is there something more to the story that we need to know?
Well, look, the general himself hasn't spoken much lately that I know of, but through attorneys and through others, he's let it be known that the reason he pled guilty to lying to the FBI was really there were two reasons. One was they were threatening him with much more serious charges that would carry very grave penalties. And apparently they were threatening to prosecute and perhaps convict and imprison his son. And he became so nervous, scared, terrified, whatever you want to put it, by that he thought that the easier way out was just to plead and avoid those greater penalties. I mean, look, we know that this is one of the things. I mean, my mother was a criminal prosecutor for years, not of this caliber, or not caliber is the wrong word, not of this stripe. She would never do something like this. But the fact is, we know that the government, whichever it is, if it's a state or especially the federal government, has unlimited resources. They have, infinite lawyers' budgets. A person like General Flynn, who's not a rich man, doesn't have those kind of resources. He was effectively bankrupted and had to sell his house. You can't fight the government forever if they're determined to come after you. And apparently he just made a calculation that it was safer for himself and his family to take the plea, even if he didn't believe quite exactly what he was signing.
Yeah, so you and I were both there at the same time. Interview after interview, Flynn's getting asked over and over again, did you do this, did you not? When you're sitting down and talking with him, was there any doubt in your mind that maybe what the government was after didn't happen and that all of this was a case of entrapment from what we're seeing now? Or were you, frankly, just what was your mindset at the time?
Well, my mindset I didn't know, for instance, that the FBI came and interviewed him the Tuesday after the inauguration. I didn't find that out until weeks later. I don't even remember when, but I didn't know it at the time that this was all happening. What was clearly happening that I remember very well was people were leaking like crazy out of the government and targeting Mike Flynn. And almost every day you'd get up, there'd be another story in the Post or somewhere saying, Flynn did this, he may have done that, he may have said this, and he may have said that. And the leaks started during the transition when the Obama administration officials were all still formally in their posts. And they continued on afterward, which suggested either, I think it's both, either that those former Obama officials were still talking to the press about this, and or that career officials in the government they were working with were continuing to feed the narrative. So it looked like an intense but kind of classic leak war to me at the time. I didn't know law enforcement had gotten involved, and I wouldn't find that out for quite a while afterward.
Michael, a lot of Democrats out there are saying he's a liar because he pled guilty. You're a communication expert. Would you advise Flynn right now to go out and make a public statement or take an interview so that he can kind of clear some of this up and explain why he pled guilty?
I would, and I actually would point to his deputy, KT McFarland, underwent the same treatment. And they were essentially trying to do to her the same thing that they did to him. One big difference is, they didn't have one of her children to target. But another big difference is, look, just the way the ball rolls sometimes. She's a fortunate lady. She's had a successful career. Her husband's had a successful career. She had more resources with which to fight this legally, to pay the lawyers and not have to worry about the financial situation of her family. But I would urge everybody to read her book and watch some of her interviews. She talks about how terrifying it is to have the massive pressure of the state after you. And even if you're a fairly prominent person and seasoned person like KT McFarland is, it's very scary to face the government on those terms. You're the little guy, no matter how prominent and how experienced you are. But she decided to stick it out and fight and not plead to anything that she didn't do. And in the end, to use a poker term, she called their bluff and they walked away without charging her, which says to me they didn't really have anything all along.
Michael, before I let you go, I want to shift subjects for a second. You spoke earlier this year at CPAC where you talked about China being the biggest threat that the U.S. faces. I couldn't agree with you more. The question that I have for you, and I apologize because we're running out of time, is so what? What can we do about it? We've talked about this with guest after guest. They own a ton of our debt. We were relying on them for so much of our pharmaceuticals and our other PPE equipment right now. What can we do to get rid of this tether that we have with them?
Well, look, the debt is at least as much of a problem for them as it is for us, arguably more so. I don't know if you've ever heard the old banking phrase. It goes like this. If you owe the bank $100,000, you have a problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, the bank has a problem. But that aside, I think what the administration is doing and trying to do, and I really applaud Peter Navarro here for leading the charge, to bring back as much manufacturing as we can, to never let go of the manufacturing of critical national security and health security, things like masks and pharmaceuticals, to bring that stuff back, re-domicile it and keep it here and never let it go again. We're going to have to do all that. We didn't dig ourselves into this hole in a year. It took a few decades. It's probably going to take, several years, if not a couple of decades, to dig our way out. But the sooner we start, the better. And we've acknowledged the hole that we're in, and that's the beginning of something positive. And I hope that this administration gets another 4 years, and that this administration turns out to have been a change in the Republican Party, where every future Republican administration sees economics this way about we need to protect the people and keep key industries home.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate your insight as someone who was there in the room when this all went down.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend. House Republicans have formed a China task force, speaking of China, but guess what? There are no Democrats. Guess why? Because they didn't want to join. Why would they do that? Congressman Michael Waltz of Florida, he's about to come up. He's a member of that task force, and he's going to tell us what's going on. Plus, Florida's chief financial officer says China needs to pay up for the damage caused by the pandemic. And guess what? He's going to tell us how Florida hopes to hold them accountable. You want to hear this when we return.